Why Singapore is one of the most prosperous nations on Earth. Singapore is the fourth most prosperous country in the world, with its citizens being one of the healthiest and most intelligent people on Earth. But just a few years back, it was a poverty-ridden, violence-filled slum with most of its citizens addicted to opium. So how did it undergo such an incredible transformation in just a few years to become Southeast Asia's financial hub? The colonial era. The Straits of Malacca was one of the most profitable shipping lanes for the British Empire in the 1800s. The empire knew it had to own a port in that area to gain maximum profit, but it seemed impossible at first. During that period, the Dutch Empire had major control over the Straits of Malacca, and nobody dared question their authority. At the time, the British Empire and the Dutch Empire were economic rivals. The British didn't want their trading activities disrupted, so they decided against doing anything to anger the Dutch. But one British man decided to get them a port in that region no matter what. Stamford Raffles, the lieutenant governor of Bencoolen at the time, set out to Southeast Asia to find a perfect spot as a port on the Straits of Malacca. Just at the edge of the straits, he found an island perfect for serving as a port. That island went on to become Singapore. He began working on setting up, but the Dutch couldn't let them take over easily. There was a lot of back and forth between the two parties, but in the end, the Dutch allowed them to take over. In 1819, Singapore got incorporated into the British Empire. After the port was created, it needed to be attractive to traders, as there were several other ports in the region. So it was made a free port, which means there were no taxes on any activity done in the port. Now that was quite attractive, as other ports were heavily taxed. Within just 4 years, Singapore became widely known as the perfect trading spot. Several traders from across the globe went there to enjoy the benefits it had to offer. Trading was going smoothly and Singapore's economy began to boom. But there was a problem: a rise in undesirable activities. At the time, there was no significant administrative rule, so everyone did as they pleased. Violence became rampant, gambling was the order of the day, and opium dens sprang up in every nook and cranny of the island. Well, this discouraged some traders, but because of its benefits, people kept using the port. In 1869, the Suez Canal in Egypt was opened. This canal allowed a decrease in travel time as it connected more places, and that meant the cost of trading got reduced, since it favored the Straits of Malacca, and the free port in Singapore became more significant. Just a year after the canal opened, Singapore earned about $32 million more than it had. Things only got better for Singapore as neighboring nations began to discover several resources that were in demand. Singapore lacked resources, but being the center of trading activities, it had the infrastructure to process the resources from neighboring countries and ship them to wherever required. Singapore was the place to be in the 1900s and was even better than every nation in that region. But everything changed during the Second World War. The fall of Singapore. The thriving country knew there would be a major problem when the Japanese Empire began conquering all the nations it came across. Before they could find a way to protect themselves, the Japanese Empire was already at their doorstep, and since Europe was quite far away, there was barely anything the British could do to help. On the 5th of February 1942, Singapore surrendered to the Japanese Empire, which was the beginning of a terrible period in the country. Everything they had built and worked for turned into shambles. Their beautiful structures crumbled, and the once glorious nature was reduced to rubble. In 1945, the war ended, and they were able to chase out the Japanese, but the nation was far too broken to be restored to its past glory. Their feeble attempt at restructuring yielded no positive results, and all they could build were slums filled with extremely violent opium addicts. Now, being a British colony, they expected help from them to restructure their nation, but they did nothing. They watched them wither away in abject poverty and did nothing to unify them when they became so diversified. Each group built a slum on the island and fended for themselves with the little resources they could find. It sometimes leads to conflict, as different groups might want what a particular group has. That lifestyle went on for years, and nobody did anything to correct it. They initially didn't demand independence from the British Empire because they saw no reason to, as they were not exploited like other colonies with resources. But as time passed, the idea of independence started to come up in people's minds because they believed the British Empire did nothing for them while facing hardships. Another thing was that independence was already becoming common, and Singapore thought, why not? Independence. The idea of independence became so strong among the people, and they started working towards it. Lee Kuan Yew was the man chosen to help take them out of the clutches of the British. The British Empire decided to create a local government to appease them, but that was not enough for the people of Singapore, as they wanted to be alone. Lee Kuan Yew, who was a British-trained lawyer, established a political party called the People's Action Party, or PAP, and was able to lead them to gain their freedom from the British Empire. But upon gaining that freedom, he believed they couldn't stand alone as a country and decided that a merger with Malaya and other colonies in their region was the best idea. It was a smart idea, as Malaya had the resources to help boost its economy and a structure that could help curb the violence. But it didn't go exactly as planned. The merger was a success, and the country of Malaysia was born on the 16th of September, 1963. Things seemed fine at first, but it dawned on the people in Singapore that the Malays of Malaya were not as accommodating as they thought. The Singaporeans were mostly Chinese, so some disputes were due to the major difference in ethnicity. The violence Lee thought would be curbed when they merged was at an alarmingly high rate, and it was due to the difference in ethnicity. 2 years after the merger, on the 9th of August 1965, Singapore got ejected from Malaysia, so it gained independence to stand alone, and of course, Lee Kuan Yew was the Prime Minister. Singapore as a country. Lee knew it would be a struggle to stand alone, but that was an understatement. Things were in a terrible state. No natural resources could lure in foreign investments. The citizens were barely educated, and of course, violence was still at a very high rate. The neighboring countries were not particularly friends, and no help would be gotten from them. And let's not forget that some Singaporeans were Malays, so there was still the issue of diversity and ethnicity. There were a lot of issues to resolve before the country could become prosperous. So what steps were taken? Lee Kuan Yew knew it would not be an easy feat, but he knew that for the country to become prosperous, its citizens had to make a major sacrifice, and that was exactly what he did. All forms of freedom were curtailed or banned to overcome the social unrest. Freedom of speech was banned, and if you questioned his authority, you were sued into bankruptcy. Political opponents were jailed without trial, and you dared not drink or use drugs or even chew gum in public. Those that were caught were severely punished. His solution to curb all the messy business of the country was an authoritarian rule. It was tough on the people, but it worked. Before independence, Singapore was a slum, and Lee needed to fix that. 70% of all Singaporeans lived in terrible housing conditions, making them pretty unhealthy. He needed the citizens to live in proper houses to be healthy, so he devised a method to ensure everyone got a proper place to live. Since he was in power, he created a law that ensured the government could buy land cheaply. After acquiring a huge expanse of land, he ordered the building of proper building structures and made them affordable to the people at low rates. The citizens were not only encouraged to buy the apartments, but a policy was created to ensure that they could afford the houses built. The policy was that the citizens had to pay a percentage of their earnings to save up for their houses. This yielded incredible success. Most of the people who lived in the slums could soon afford to live in proper homes. But housing was not the only problem. People would not be able to afford houses if they had no source of income, and the unemployment issue also had to be fixed. But the country had no natural or human resources, so foreign investors were not attracted to the country. But Singapore thrived once due to the no-tax policy, which was exactly what Lee Kuan Yew decided to adopt. When companies discovered the tax rate was very low, they began trooping in. The country's policy in regards to employment was favorable to the companies, making everything more attractive. The country began to thrive, soon becoming one of the second easiest countries to trade. But Lee had bigger plans for the country, as he knew that highly educated citizens were important. Since they had no natural resources, human resources were important. So he began creating technical schools and paid foreign workers to train the citizens in high-paying skills. Soon the citizens became highly skilled, and the country got ahead of several countries with natural resources. The country also needed its own enterprises, so a group of smart civil servants was brought together to spearhead the creation of state-owned companies. Normally, state-owned companies were not successful, but not that of Singapore, as companies that incurred losses were closed within the twinkle of an eye, and a better, more organized one was created. These state-owned companies include Singapore Airlines, companies producing steel and iron, and manufacturers of chemical and chemical-based products, among others. Besides that, the country returned to being the hub for trade as the port was reopened and made better. The port in Singapore is currently the second largest in the world, and the country itself is the second easiest nation to do business in. The several well-thought-through policies and the measures that were created ensured that Singapore became one of the most prosperous nations in the world. Thank you very much for watching until the end. If you could, kindly like, share, and subscribe. And please, we invite you to share your thoughts in the comments section below. Until next time.